Yeah, so I'm kind of taking this ritual and play at like a bit of a different lens. I'm coming at it from a practical perspective. I'm also bringing it back down to like analog play. So to start off, I do want to share something that's relatively new that is becoming a key aspect to my artistic practice. So my research as a whole involves landscape rituals, consumption rituals, play rituals, and from my perspective as a painter, that kind of provides me with a lot of ritual objects that have the potential to become subjects in my paintings. And I want to combine all of these different objects because they all kind of overlap in various areas. So I want to explore that visually. So when I need ideas for my paintings, I actually play a small game. So I have these cards, and on each card is a specific ritual object, a potential subject for my paintings. And this ranges from communion objects like tables, plates, cups, chess pieces, puzzle boxes, illustrations from historical texts, and my own photos. So I shuffle these cards kind of as if I was shuffling my own tarot cards, which is also something I do as like a ritual reflection kind of exercise. And that was also the inspiration for those. So I just do a ripple shuffle and then just a regular shuffle. Then I kind of cut the cards into three, reshuffle them, again, cut them one last time. And then I pull a card from the top of each pile, which is here. And then each pull makes like a row of three. And that row of three is one group. And that group is going to be used to make a painting. And although this is like a fun little exercise, this does serve the purpose of bringing play and ritual into my creative practice. So far I found that this helps me come up with new ideas for compositions that I probably wouldn't have come up with, and combining objects that I wouldn't think to combine. And this little game isn't just about creating art, it actually connects to ideas on how we can use play and ritual in our lives, especially when things feel chaotic and stressful. So the most recent example of this sort of mass uncertainty is during COVID and its isolation periods. There was a huge temporal and spatial disruption, which forced us to find new ways to live, work, and play. And this often happened within the same limited domestic spaces. And during this disruption, many people found comfort in ordinary routines. And I also want to note that in this context, routines are casually transparent. So the goal lies in the action, but rituals are casually opaque, and the actions are symbolic without really having a physical effect on the world. But I'm arguing that when routines are given more significance and start to affect non-physical things like stress, anxiety, their goals become more symbolic and they start to become casually opaque on top of their normal transparency. And I think that this is a transformation of routine into ritual. So some examples of these routines would be things like making coffee, going to daily walks, having like a strict routine, just a normal routine basically. And these routines were grounding, and our homes were turned into special domestic ritual spaces that became our own magic circles where we created rituals and games as a means of coping with stress and anxiety. And this is where we lack control in one area, we seek to gain in another area of our personal lives. And these rituals, like my card shuffling, offer us a sense of compensatory control, which helps to regain agency in times of uncertainties. And these ideas around play and ritual and compensatory control in confined domestic spaces directly inform my paintings. I'm drawn to analog forms of play, so like my little card ritual, and traditional games like puzzle boxes, chess. And this interest stems from a key observation that analog games inherently contain ritualistic mechanisms that are built into their very gameplay. And this is seen pretty clearly in the repetition, redundancy, and rigidity in the movement of solving a puzzle box, and within the precise and repetitive movements associated with chess. And these ritualistic mechanisms turn these play objects into small areas of control and resonate with how we often seek out structure and ritual in our everyday lives, especially when external control is limited. So I initially documented myself interacting with puzzle boxes, and I would take note of all the repetitive and ritualistic behaviors that occur when trying to solve them. And it's these two puzzle boxes here that I also brought, so at some point you can fiddle with them and have your own mini ritualistic experience. They all have different levels of difficulty, so this one was a much harder one to solve than this one. And this difficult box facilitated more ritualistic movements, especially like the repeated twisting motion of these little sections here. And a lot of those moves were redundant as well. But there's not really much to work with this one. Once you move one piece, it basically falls apart. So there's like a disconnection for me to this box, but this one was more rewarding to open, and it had more significance as a ritual object. And this is because the more repetitive, redundant, and rigid actions within a ritual, the more effective and important it is deemed as. And these little pencil studies as well were made just when I was thinking of ways to reconnect with these objects visually. So I just did little tonal studies. And I was also thinking of these as like little alchemical objects, as like closed vessels that contain transformation that occurs with the aid of the hands. And then after initially exploring the puzzle box, I wanted to move on to chess, which I was drawn to because the chess pieces and the board represent two distinct different objects that serve as a bridge between analog play objects and domestic ritual spaces. So the chessboard has defined rules of boundaries and represents both a game in a magic circle while simultaneously paralleling the idea of a domestic ritual space. And this is a perfect subject to explore how structured analog play can create its own ritual within a confined environment. And then this kind of led me on to paintings of tables, which symbolize like confined worlds, domestic spaces, and the ritualistic nature of both games and everyday life. So when setting up the table to play a game or just saying it for dinner, it becomes a ritual object, especially when those routines are given more significance in a time of uncertainty like during COVID. So the chessboard with its grid and fixed movements acts as a visual parallel to the tables in my work. They both represent domestic ritual spaces where routine and meaningful action occur within defined boundaries. So going back to my little card ritual, these are pencil drawings that come directly from the card shuffling ritual. And drawing these objects allows me to explore compositions and experiment in a low risk way. And these are all on A5 paper, and then they have a border on, so they're really small. And this means that there's a limit to the amount of detail that you can include, which also means that when I eventually translate these into larger oil paintings, it's going to make the process a little bit simpler. These being so monochromatic, it kind of leaves room for me to explore different pigments and different types of transparency without worrying about creating something super rendered, so that when I eventually do turn these into paintings, there'll be more of my personal painting ritual showing through. And I will briefly talk about painting rituals in a moment. So I have some images of some of the reference photos that I like to work from. So these two here are the Lewis chess piece, which is from the 12th century. And the photos of it are pretty bright. They have a lot of contrasts and they're really clear and there's a lot of texture there. So these reference images really have the potential to let me work with the transparency and the brush marks and different pigments and things like that. And these chessboard or game images are from the Spanish 13th century book of games. And this is basically, it just explains 3 different game types: games of skill, which is chess; games of chance, which are dice; and then you have a combination of skill and chance, and this is a game called tables. And the book contains a lot of really rich illustrations, and they also include like 4-person chess and like astrological chess. So there's loads of really interesting images to work from, and they're super flat and quite simple but detailed at the same time. So ritual objects are the main subjects in my paintings, but the practice that I use is highly ritualized. So I use grid lines, which is also a callback to the chessboard; detailed pencil marks, which provides an underlying structure similar to rules in a game or ritual, but this isn't something that's completely necessary. A lot of the time I would go in directly with paint and not worry about a drawing, but these are kind of, this ritual is an important part of the process now. And it's not just for the sake of ritual. Each step of the process is simplified so that when working on the drawing or the painting, it's a form of soft fascination, which comes from Kaplan's attention restoration theory for environmental psychology. But this is able to be used in other areas, and this kind of comes from like another part of my research as a whole. But I found that similar to how my card shuffling ritual kind of helps me to start thinking visually and thinking of ways to combine objects, doing this really repetitive action of drawing grid on a white background is kind of like getting into this space to make something, and it's like this weird transition of states from not painting to now like I'm going to be painting. Or the drawing also helps with this, where it's like I'm getting closer to entering the painting stage, so I'm like warming up, and I'm starting to think about painting more directly. The structure exists beneath transparent pigments and explores layers of visibility within the work itself. And the transparency is important because it not only lets the grid lines and pencil marks show through, but it also shows the repetitive hatching motions in my painting. And it kind of shows the artist's hand and imbues the work with my own like physical energy, which also refers back to the hand of the player and the artist being visible throughout these analog play objects. It's like the malleability of these objects being explored through the malleable oil paint. And the difference between routine and ritual in my practice is that I'm doing this deliberately, and the goal is to have both the painting and to give a sense of control to the oil painting, which can often, for me, feel quite unpredictable. So just to summarize, my work explores how these simple acts of play and ritual, either through a card game, before painting, or through playing chess on a living room table, how these actions help us navigate any disruptions and help us find meaning and control and some fun in unpredictable and uncertain times.